Hello, my name is Martin McClellan and this is a video summary of my Farmington Institute research for 2019-2020. The title of my research is Church, Schools and Academisation, a comparative study of two approaches. In my research this year, I had a look at the policy framework and legislation context for the Academy's policy in the United Kingdom. I looked at the development of charter schools in the United States of America. I looked at the responses of two different dioceses to Academisation, those being the Diocese of Salisbury and the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Liverpool. I looked at secondary school performance in the two dioceses, and then I came up with some summary thoughts and some concluding reflections. But firstly, a little bit of a fun run through educational legislation since 1944. And 1944 was a pivotal year in terms of education policy with the 1944 Education Act, which did three really important things in terms of church schools and the current framework that we have in our country. Firstly, it cemented the relationship of church schools to the state in terms of the what is known as the dual system. That was enshrined in the legislation, much to the relief of church and school leaders. The second very important aspect of the 1944 Act was to create the Secretary of State for Education, which was an elevation from the previous post of just superintendent. And the third crucial thing from the 1944 Act was the establishment of local authorities as the administrative lead for education in their areas, and that local authority responsibility has been with us for a long time now. Moving on very quickly into the 60s and 70s, there was very little change since the 1944 Act. One thing that I failed to mention there was that the Act also expected the local authorities to review education provision in their area. And almost without exception across the whole country, local authorities decided on a three-tier system of grammar, secondary modern and technical schools. And it would be a test at the age of 11 based on the aptitude and intelligence of children as to which school they would go to. In the 1960s and 70s, however, there was an increasing demand for the philosophy of comprehensive education to be looked at very carefully, and this had come from different parts of Europe, America, Australia, and eventually the UK government implemented the comprehensive system in 1976. Since 1976, there has been a bit of a revolution, I would say, in education provision in this country, because it was only up until that point local authorities were responsible for administration, school admissions, school finances, transition, all those things, HR, recruitment, all those things which had very, very little to do with school improvement and school standards. And it was in the late 1970s, with successive prime ministers and education ministers, that curriculum evaluation really took a hold in schools, and also the concept of actually improving schools and really addressing standards rather than structures came to the fore. If we look at the work of Jim Callaghan and Shirley Williams for the Labour Party, if we look at the work of Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, who was revolutionary in terms of her approach to education policy, and still remains one of the few education ministers to have received a standing ovation at the National Union of Teachers Conference. And then moving on into the reforms of Tony Blair in the late 1990s with the education mantra of the Labour Party, which could easily be supplanted for the mantra of standards when you look at the white paper that came out, which was the first introduction to specialist colleges in the United Kingdom. And it's really the work of the Tony Blair government in terms of introducing specialist colleges and academies into the UK educational framework, and much of it came out of the the admiration of the charter schools program in the United States of America. Andrew Adonis, one of Tony Blair's advisors at the time, studied the charter school movement very carefully and came back with a very similar conclusion to myself, that the charter schools provide a fantastic addition to the education system in the United States of America. I spent some time looking very carefully at the William Penn Charter School in Philadelphia. It is very much, I very much recommend reading the mission statement of that school. We're looking at their strategic plan for the next 10 years. We're looking at how they're addressing curriculum, looking at how they're addressing teaching standards, looking at how they're addressing pupil outcomes, looking at how they're addressing the needs of the students in the 21st century, all wrapped up in a very explicit Christian framework. In the case of the William Penn School, that framework is based primarily around the Quaker philosophy and beliefs, and so it's incredible how the charter school has impacted upon the Academy's drive. And if you look at the history of the Academy's movement, it was certainly in the gift of both Labour governments and Conservative governments to actually transform education for the benefit of children. And there was very little disagreement about the Academy's programme across the House of Commons on both sides of the political spectrum. They all believed that education should be at the heart of government. They all believed that policy should be addressed to the many and not just the few, and those are the words of Tony Blair in his white paper, but also the words of Michael Gove when he was addressing disadvantaged children through the pupil premium. And with the advent of the city technology colleges and city academies and specialist technology colleges, there was a great expansive program of academy conversion right up until 2010, when we look at the coalition government of David Cameron for the Conservatives, and of course with the Liberal Democrat Party of Nick Clegg. By 2010, at that point, there were 203 academies in the country. When the coalition came to power, the emerging priority of that coalition was to reduce public spending, and the Building Schools for the Future programme was one of the things that was taken out. But also at that point, Michael Gove had been announced as Education Secretary, and within barely 2 months it was quite clear that his education legislation programme was going to be quite revolutionary, and he introduced the first wave of free schools, and almost less than 2 years later, almost half the secondary schools in the country were academies. Michael Gove was also very keen that faith schools should be included in the Academy's programme, and he forged very strong links with both the Roman Catholic and the Church of England boards of education. Academies under the Conservative Party were here to stay. It's clear in my mind that the Academy's programme was born out of the frustration and disquiet of local authority preservation of school structures at the expense of ensuring that school standards were of the highest priority. And it was clear that the standards agenda in the late 20th century and early 21st century was a national issue that required a national response. And the Academy's programme was something that united both Labour and Conservative parties. I do wonder now, though, whether the argument has come full circle and that we're now at a period where academies are becoming the structural divide rather than the standard solution. And so I looked at two different dioceses and their approach to academisation. Firstly, I looked at the Salisbury Diocese Board of Education. Salisbury supports 194 schools across the diocese. 95 of these schools are academies, and the Diocesan Board of Education is explicitly committed to academisation of all its schools, particularly moving schools into multi-academy trusts. And the diocese itself has standalone academies, schools within multi-academy trusts, and its own multi-academy trust as well. The Archdiocese of Liverpool, the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Liverpool, I also examined, and a very, very different approach to them, and you can read about all that in my research paper. But the policy of the Archdiocese of Liverpool was that no trustee schools are allowed to become academies. No voluntary aided diocesan schools are allowed to become academies. The Archbishop, as trustee, holds this policy and is supported in this by the Diocesan Education Team. A very, very strong, solid stance against academisation. I met with the directors of both of the directors of education of both of the dioceses, and it's quite clear that they're both committed to raising school standards in the schools within their diocese. However, they are approaching it from very, very different personal, political and educational standpoints. There are some academies in the Liverpool diocese, including some ecumenical church schools, and they were created in the first tranche of academies back in the late 1990s. Some academies in Liverpool have been formed out of the old religious orders moving away from educational provision due to a lack of numbers within the order, or a reframing of their priorities as well. But it's interesting how the structure of school improvement in the two dioceses is very different. One, given the focus of school improvement from within, and another, given the responsibility for school improvement to multi-academy trusts and the leadership within those trusts. I analysed the respective performance of secondary schools in the two dioceses, and those figures are included in my report. But it also, for me, in terms of my concluding thoughts, I would say that the education system seems to be in the UK as divisive as ever. There are almost 20 different types of school, and as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, I think we're suffering from the 20th century obsession of school structure rather than emphasising the school standards agenda at every opportunity. Some schools are being broken into academies which have little connect with the communities they serve, and we're also at risk of promoting structure over standards in two ways. The structural danger of maintaining faith schools at the expense of high standards of education is a real danger, I fear. And it's very important that church school leaders take very, very robust decisions about the importance of the highest possible standards in their schools. I do think the approach taken by the Salisbury Diocese is very clear, unambiguous, and effective at raising standards. I do think that some of the schools in the Archdiocese of Liverpool appear to be, and it will require further research, appear to be maintaining the structure at the expense of standards. But that would obviously require further research as well. Talking of further research, I firmly believe the study has been incredibly interesting, hugely illuminating in terms of my lack of knowledge and understanding of education history, particularly enamored with and animated with the charter school movement in the United States of education. I'd love to do further research on that, and I'm sure that the Farmington Institute would welcome, not necessarily myself, but somebody else looking into how the charter school movement can actually contribute to the increasing standards of education in our country.